Okay, and so as we continue, finished up with Lab 301, moving forward into Lab 302, one thing that we've been doing so far is what you could consider just to be very manual server-side validation. And so we've been validating our data and checking it to make sure it's a number and that the number is within a range and it's not undefined, and a lot of ways, is it truthy or is it falsy, and we're writing a lot of if statements, and you know we're writing them on the server. So that's what we've been doing so far, and that's what this lecture is about, is a different way of validating data on the server using a package called Joy. You can kind of see it has 8 million weekly downloads, and so it's a very popular package for doing that. And so this is a validation package to, again, validate data on the server. Now, when it comes to data validation, the first thing that I would point out in any sort of lecture is that traditionally, there's 3 places where data validation takes place and should take place. And so, 3 tiers, if you will. And so a lot of times you'll hear a 3-tiered architecture, but more commonly you hear front end and back end. And so when you think of the front end, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that's front end code. It's called front end code because it's sent down to the client, and literally the client can inspect your HTML, they can inspect your CSS, and they can inspect your front end JavaScript and look at the code. It's literally code sent to the client. Okay, but when it comes to the back end, really the back end is comprised or composed of 2 tiers. Okay, the back end is composed of the application tier, which is your Express.js and your Node.js. It's that application tier that's considered part of the back end, that middle tier, and then the database tier. And the database tier is the Mongo side in this case. And so data validation can take place and should take place in all 3 tiers. You got the front end, JavaScript, the middle tier, the application tier, and the database tier. Now, traditionally, when you were doing normalized databases, there are a lot of rules on the database tier. And so, you've got rows and columns, and every column has a data type, and you've got relationships between tables, and you've got constraints on the data that are very strict constraints. And so, there's a lot of, in a traditional application, in a normalized database, there's a lot of validation that takes place in the database tier. But in the Mongo world, there's not as much, right? Mongo's kind of free-spirited. Mongo's kind of like, hey, the database schema can change, and different records can have different properties, and it's a little more free-flowing. And so not a lot of data validation is taking place in a Mongo database in the database tier. There are some rules on the database tier. For example, if you set up an index on email, you saw this, that when I set up an index on an email property, it sets up a unique constraint, right? So that you cannot have multiple email addresses registered. And Mongo will actually, if you have a unique constraint, Mongo will kick back an error and say, no, that's not allowed with the data. And so there is some validation that still takes place in a Mongo database, but just not as much as a traditional normalized database. Okay, so then it comes down to, okay, we need to do validation on the front end or in the middle tier, right? So front end tier or middle end tier, not a whole lot of validation still taking place on Mongo. And there's, again, you're going to want to do both. The answer is you do both validation on the front end and the middle tier. And there's some explanation there. validation on the front end with JavaScript, maybe Bootstrap has validation. If you've ever looked at the Bootstrap docs, and you can do validation on your form data, right? So you can kind of get this kind of Bootstrap front end validation. It's great. Front end validation is like on a per keystroke basis. Like literally, I'm typing a key, and on every keystroke, it can go from, hey, this is good, to this is not good, right? So front end validation is very snappy. It's very quick. The processing on the front end validation happens on the client. So there's a lot of advantages to not doing the processing on the server. So advantages of front end validation using a tool like Bootstrap validation, it's fast, it's snappy. The processing doesn't take place on the server. Of course, if you can offload the processing off of the server onto the client, you want to do that. Another advantage is you don't have to wait for a submit button and cause a round trip, right? A round trip is a trip to the server, back to the client, right? So that network communication doesn't have to happen. All this validation is happening locally on the client, so there's no network communication that has to, go from a client computer to some server somewhere on the internet and then a response back to the client, right? So those are advantages and why we want to do validation on the client on the front end, right? You definitely want to do validation on the front end. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about validation on the middle tier. So if there's so many benefits to doing validation on the front end, why would we also do it on the middle tier? And the answer is pretty simple. At the end of the day, you can't trust front end validation. It's not secure. That's why when it comes to security, you have to put things like credit card processing, for example, and validation of a credit card. You're not going to validate someone's credit card on the client, just like you're not going to, validate your data only on the client. You have to also validate it on the server. Why is it not trusted? Again, security is the answer why we do validation on the middle tier. Well, unfortunately, savvy developers and savvy hackers, if you will, they know how to get around, because that JavaScript is written and sent down to the client. Savvy developers know how to inspect that code. They know how to modify JavaScript and frankly get around the validation that you may have written. So maybe, if you're validating, an email address, and you send that JavaScript down to the client to validate that email address. Well, a developer can inspect your code. They can see the JavaScript that you wrote to validate that email address, and they can change it. And then they can change that on their client side, right? And then send the code to your server that gets around your validation. In fact, they don't even have to do that. They can use a tool like Postman, right? Postman can send data to your server without validating it at all. And so there are tools like Postman that can get around validation. And frankly, there are other tools that hackers use to, send data to your server without using the script that you send down to the client. So there's a lot of benefits to using client-side validation. The one downfall against client-side validation is you just can't trust it by itself. Therefore, you must validate your data on the server for security purposes. Now, the tool that we're going to learn today is called Joy. To my knowledge, it's the most widely used tool for implementing application tiered validation. Okay, in Node. It's not required. You could continue, as we've been doing so far, validating your data manually. Okay, and so what have we been doing so far? We're just writing a bunch of if statements. Okay, and so depending, if you're being very thorough with your validation, you know, you might have, 5 pieces of data, and you need to check to make sure that they're not undefined, that they're not empty string, that they're, greater than some value, that they're, they can be parsed into a number. There's all these if statements that you have to write. And so what it boils down to is that using Joy, one benefit of using Joy over what we've been doing so far is it really simplifies the code that you have to write. You don't have to write 15 if statements to validate your data. And so as we get into working with Joy, you're going to see that the way that we validate the data is less verbose, right? So it actually just takes a lot less code to implement the validation. Then again, if you're being very thorough with your if statements, it can be fairly complex and a fair amount of code. And just because you write it doesn't mean it's easy to understand, right? So there's more code traditionally with a bunch of if else's, if else's, if else's. And just because you can understand it, doesn't mean someone else can understand it. So Joy is fairly easy to understand. As we get into it, you're going to see it's not super complex. And so that's data validation. That's the places data validation take place. That's the pros and cons of doing validation in each tier. Ultimately, I probably should have said this off to the top, data validation is super critical in that you don't want to put bad information into a database, right? Junk information that goes into a database results in, very simply, junk information out of a database. So junk in, junk out. And so you don't want to allow junk into your database, because in modern business, applications, CEOs, managers, people that make business decisions for their corporations, they want to be data driven in 2023. They want to make their decisions based on good data, right? That they're collecting good data and that they're analyzing lots of big data, and then they're able to make their decisions to drive the business in the right direction based on data. Not, just in the days of old, CEOs would just kind of use their gut and use what they think. They weren't using data-driven decisions, okay? But in modern day business, CEOs should use data to guide their decisions, okay? So if it's so important for these CEOs to make business decisions based on data, you want to make sure that data is good, right? If they're making decisions to drive their business in the right direction, and you being the developer, you being the application, the database administrator, whatever, you're letting all this junk data into your database, and they're pulling that junk data out, and they're making their decisions based on junk data, that could very well lead them in the wrong direction, okay? So data is critical to have good data in, therefore good data out, therefore, make good decisions on the day-to-day. Okay. Now, in this example, I'm going to start just by doing just an empty folder here called demo, and kind of start simple with this without too much code. So let's open this up in code. And doing init/y, so we get a package JSON, and then let's bring in Joy. So that's the command to install Joy. And you're going to see on the NPM docs, there's not a whole lot of documentation. They basically point you right to their website. So if you kind of go to npm.com, search up Joy, you're going to see they just say, hey, go to joy.dev. Here's the website, and we're going to get started with Joy. So it's kind of a 3-part process. We're going to define what's called a schema. We're going to bring in Joy. We're going to define a schema. We're going to get our data. And then we're going to validate our schema. So again, part 1, define your schema. Part 2, kind of get the data. And part 3 is validate. And so that example can be simplified a lot. So I'm not going to start with that example. Okay, but the docs, I just want to point this out, is going to be where you're not getting a whole lot off of this npm README file. Instead, you're going to go to the joy.dev website and really doing your research and trial and error here. And so one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to validate some data to see that a piece of data is a number. Okay, so that's going to be kind of the first example that I do. Now that we have a package JSON, let's go ahead and say validate number. So let's make a new file called validate number.js. And then we're going to bring in Joy using our import. Now, a lot of times, in the docs, the variable that you're bringing in, they capitalize it. Okay, it's not a requirement. You could do a lowercase, but I'm just in the docs as you go through it. You're going to see a lot of times they bring it in as a capital letter J. Okay, so the reason for that is it kind of follows like a C# kind of syntax where your classes are Pascal cased. They start with a capital letter. And so Joy developers kind of follow that convention. And so in their documentation, they capitalize that J. Doesn't have to be, but I'm going to follow that convention. I'm also going to say type is module here. Okay, so that we can bring in our import. Okay, so 3 parts is part 1, let's define a schema. And you could call this number schema if you want to. Equals, and we're going to use that variable, JOI dot, and you can see joy.number and something like that. Const data equals the number 50. And let's do schema, number schema dot validate. Now you can see there's 2 methods here, validate and validate async. So there's a asynchronous method and a synchronous method. They're pretty similar. The one way that they do handle things differently is with the way they return the data. I'm going to, and I've used both, I'm just going to use the synchronous version for now. I'm going to say number schema dot validate, and we pass our data to it. All right, and this will actually return a result. So I'll say const validate result equals. Okay, so define the schema. In this case, we're just saying, hey, it's a number, and we want to check to see if data follows that schema. And so right now we're just doing a very simple joy.number and store the result in validate result. And I'll do console.log validate result. And node mon validate number.js. And it didn't save, so let's just do node validate number.js. Okay. And so I thought I had saved NodeMon as a developer dependency, but it's saying it doesn't know what NodeMon is. So I just ran the node command and we get the value of 50. So that is essentially passing validation. When you run the validate method, it returns, you can see it returns an object. Okay. Whereas if you use the validate async, it would return, if it didn't validate, it would basically throw an exception. And so you would need a try catch block in that case. But we're just going to use this synchronous version validate. And so when it passes, you just kind of get the data back, and it says value of 50. Now if I change this to ABC, okay, and I run this again, you're going to see this is our error. So we get the value back, but we also get an error property, and this essentially is our this is our validation working, saying, hey, we wanted this to be a number, and we're getting an error message back. So this is Joy working. This is Joy, basically returning an error message into validate result, saying, hey, there's an error. We need to fix it. Now, to kind of come back into here, so this is joy.number. Well, that's the most basic thing here, but you can kind of, going through the docs, you could say, oh, what if I want a number greater than 5? Pretty straightforward. If I want a number to be a whole number, not a decimal, a floating point number. Okay, number greater than, a number less than. Max and min are just inclusive, right? So you would say minimum value of 0 means greater than or equal to 0, right? So max and min versus less and greater, less and greater are not inclusive, max and min are inclusive. So I can kind of come in here and I could say number, like maybe this is a test score, right? So I could say min of 0, max 100. And if I change my data to be 75, and you can see our validation is working value of 75. Now let's do npm install node mon --save -dev. And now let's run node mon validate number.js. I'd prefer to get NodeMon working. What am I doing here? I was forgetting it's a -G on NodeMon. There's a difference between a global dependency and a developer dependency. I was doing that incorrect. Okay, now NodeMon is installed globally. That's what I was looking for. You don't do it every day, so just forgot. So now let's run NodeMon validate number.js. And I may need to save and reboot. Bring up my new terminal. I'm even going to close my terminal and reopen it. Okay, running scripts is disabled. Different error. Been here before. If you've done that, let's copy that and paste and go. This is a different machine. We have fixed this now a handful of times. We're going to go to this one, copy that into PowerShell, run as administrator, paste, enter, yes to all, close it down, reboot, restart the terminal, node mon, much better, value 75. Okay, all right, so there's 75. Now, minimum max, okay, so of course if we do 101 or 71, 101, save it, now you can see we get a value error. Let's try a couple other things, right? Let's try empty string. Does not accept empty string. Value must be a number, right? Makes sense. Let's do null. Does not accept null. Value must be a number. Let's do undefined. Save that. Now undefined gets through, so that's interesting. So I'm just pointing that out, that if your data goes undefined,
so because we're all on the same network, it could just be simple as giving it that IP address. Because we're all on 172.168.0.
it doesn't like const data. Let's do let data. So if you just declare a variable here, let data, by default it's undefined. Like, you don't have to set it equal to undefined. Data by default is undefined, and then if you validate it, that actually passes validation. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, if you want to not allow that, which I'm sure you don't, dot required. You want to make it a required field. Now dot required no longer passes data is required, therefore undefined is no longer acceptable. Okay, so if the value is undefined, you mark it as required, that is how you fix that problem. So Grant, you tracking so far?
Yeah, I'm understanding.
All right. So again, step 1, define your schema. Step 2, define your data. Step 3, validate. Stored and validate result. Now,
The cluster manager has to manage those types. So we supply the IP address of 172.168.0.125 to the cluster itself.
let's check this out. So if I put a string number,
Almost certain that IP address is
because that can be parsed into a number, just pointing that out, that is also passable. Okay, so even though technically this is a string because it's in quotes, there is a number in that string, and so that is considered valid, which I would expect it to be, but just pointing that out. One more thing that you can do here. This error message is fine. I'm going to format this output a little differently. There is a JSON object in JavaScript, so you can write this in vanilla JavaScript. That's what we're writing here. JSON stringify validate results. So I'm just going to stringify, and let's put some bad data here. Let data. So you can kind of see, I don't know. This is in a little bit different format if I stringify it. Now you can actually stringify, you can actually pass it the data, null, and then 2. And you can look that up. You can see this actually gives us more information. Because I don't know if you, I'm just gonna do console log what we had originally, validation results. Okay, so I'm gonna just compare these two outputs. right? So if I look at this object, you could see there's a details property with an object inside of it, but you can't really see the details. You can't see the object inside of details. And so if I change this to kind of format this data a little differently, it allows us to dig down into the details.
Box is created by you creating the cluster manager service, right? So you go through the process
And
ROM server one,
again, here you can kind of see value is required.
these two devices need to be
This
added
is
to
in
the
an
server.
array. And you can kind of see that, but if you dig down into details, here you can see messages required. So it just basically, when you stringify this, it kind of lets you see the result object in a better format, right? You're formatting the output so you can read it a little bit better. Okay.
A bit more, yeah.
Okay.
So
It's basically the virtual
So-
service. So basically, like when you click on Hyper-V and you create a new virtual machine,
Let's go back to the
it's
docs.
essentially
See if there's
the same
anything
thing you're doing
else.
when you create the failover cluster manager, right? Because you're creating a virtual service that other servers can contact to ensure that they're part of that cluster, right? Because what we're talking about here, we're talking about resiliency, right? We're talking about the ability for a system.
Those are the main ones. You want a positive number.
Take over, right?
Not sure why we're scrolling. We're going to get into validating objects. Let's move on.
the cluster is like a file almost.
Almost, yes. It's a virtual service. Again. It's a
Okay.
service that's
So
running.
again, that was
It's
validating
running
numbers,
outside of the school.
validating dates.
And I have two different servers.
So
Let's validate strings.
my question is, it's kind of like the thing that we
So I'm going to make another file here.
after everyone left the test,
Validate.
and I'm just kind of trying to combine those two.
Okay. So
You have
import
to refresh it.
Because
Joy.
we were talking about
from
the
Joy.
administrator for if you were
The ownership. Right,
ownership.
right.
Right.
So,
So
Let's get a
if you have
schema.
the ownership of the file, and then so you have ownership of the file.
Now there's joy.string.
The cluster.
Const
And
data
that's on the
equals,
server two.
this is a string.
The administrator on the server 3.
Const
yes.
validation result equals, I'll say string schema
Just virtually residing on here, right?
So with
String
everything
schema
cluster, we'll have
dot
this.
validate
I mean,
data.
That was a simple.
It was. It was a simpler way to explain it. Right?
and
Sometimes
console
that's needed, right?
log
Sometimes I go into some pretty
Uh,
complex
validation
explanations,
result.
sometimes a simpler ones. That's it. And that virtual-
Okay, now we're still running the old file, so I'm going to close that.
That is
node
saying for
mon,
all the other machines
validate
that tell it to
string,
connect to it, to connect to it into the
And this
configuration.
means
Yes.
validation passed, right?
What
Okay,
it does,
so-
of course,
Of course,
is allows each machine to
joy.50,
act
we get an
independently
error
and
message.
dependent off of the other. They're still independent servers, right?
Right.
They're doing their own thing, but the cluster service
Minimum length of one character.
data is duplicated between servers on the shared data stores, and that if something fails on one, the other one can take over.
Oh,
Okay.
So that's why they.
I
have
meant to put that on
they
the
have
schema.
to share that connection between themselves.
Okay,
Makes sense?
so
Yes.
Okay.
right now, if I were to do empty string, validation result, validate data,
Oh yeah. Okay. Be careful. This is good for you.
Yeah.
Expand storage.
okay.
I wish I knew that was my word.
Disks. Alright, so we have 3 disks. Show that 3 disk and cluster disk 1, cluster disk 2, cluster disk 3 are present. Right click roles.
Let's do string dot min of 2, like state abbreviation, right?
The cluster of disk
So if I
one,
do
and
I,
disk 2 and disk 3.
um,
All one
here value must be at least 2 characters long. That's what I would expect. Now, if I don't have a min, something that
cluster. So they'll all
just
share
want
the
to point
exact
out,
same
right?
values.
Yes,
Value is not allowed to be empty. So it does need to have some data in it. And so joy.string does more or less have a
that share information between
required.
each other.
You're going to get kind of the same deal. There's an implied required there. You can't have an empty string. But if I say dot min of 2, point is the min version here is a number of characters, not like a numeric 2, right? So like on a joy number,
And those storage area networks share information to each other
on a number, if you had a min of 2, well, that's a numeric 2 instead of 2 characters. Does that make sense?
So you're talking about like one server fails, like one server's cluster.
You with me, Grant?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, no, you're good. You're
And
good.
its cluster will take
Then just kind of the same thing here. I would probably JSON stringify this validation result just to print out error messages a little bit in more detail, where you can get into value not allowed to be empty.
Very prevalent in the military is what we call backbreaking.
But if I put a good value in, it just accepts it.
Give it back to me.
So eventually we'll be, checking to see if there is an error message, and if so, what do we do with it? Now again, this is on the application tier, and so a lot of times your error messages are just kind of left for the front end, right? You're going to let your front end give the pretty error messages back. This is just like a validation of the last resort, if you will, just making sure you don't put bad data into the database. So let me kind of go back into here and
Yeah, see, it literally says configuring new IP address.
now,
So each time you do that, you're applying an IP address to each one of these instances. It's going to
okay, string requires alphanumeric, requires a string to be A through Z, or 0 through 9. So alpha num, pretty straightforward, right? String alpha num.
Next to stats and owner node. I'm doing stats and owner node.
And so if I throw in a special character,
I'm more.
I would not expect that to pass.
Oh, okay. So I see what you're saying.
Must only
That's
contain
basically-
alphanumeric
okay,
characters.
This one we just
So-
assigned to a data.
Just really want to point out again, the docs are your best friend. I don't have all this memorized, but I do know where to get the information should I need it. If I'm trying to validate a string, what about a credit card? Well, they make it pretty easy to validate a credit card.
The replication is going to occur between the two disks.
Now, you can change what that looks like.
And we're
So let's just do that. Joy string credit card. I mean, that's pretty cool.
right. So, and now that anything is inside your data manifest, we're going to be able to share everything that's inside of the data manifest, right? So this being available storage means it has not been assigned.
So what is a 4444 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4? Does that seem about right?
What's called a witness net. Okay, basically that witness
Value
net
must be a credit card. Well, it
is
doesn't
going
like
to
that.
ensure that what is supposed
So
to
the
happen
question is,
now doesn't
I'm
necessarily
pretty sure
do
it's
anything
4
bad
sets
about it.
of.
But a witness
Yep.
node,
So let's see if I
in this
delete
case,
the
is a specific
hyphen.
list that is witnessing what's occurring between
If not, what
the
exactly is
cluster
it expecting?
and services, and ensuring that it is working the way it's supposed to. That makes sense? It's
Using
almost
an
not quite like a
algorithm.
zero cyclic redundancy.
Requires a number to be a credit card number.
TCP three-way handshake, but it is a way that a third person
Oh.
can kind of look at the process that's going on between those two and ensure
So
data is being transferred.
it doesn't like that all my 5s are such obviously fake numbers. And so you would need
Shared the way it needs to be shared.
something that actually is a credit
I don't
card.
even think that would be needed until you start reading it out and go, yeah, there's a lot of crap that can go wrong.
Interesting.
Now we're in the field of-
So I'm not going to put my credit card number in here, but let's just. Well, that's not it either.
Expand that.
Okay. Well, I'm not. I believe the whole point is it's a little bit. It's smart enough to know that my fake credit card number is not a valid credit card. So lots of different ways to validate strings. Let's kind of. Trim is useful. You know what a trim is. Kind of get rid of the white space on the front and the end. So string.trim is very useful. And string.email. So let's do string.email. String.email. Data. I would expect that to say, hey, it's not an email. So if I do data@gmail.com and refresh that, that is accepted, right? So pretty safe way or pretty simple way, I would say, to validate an email address. You can do regular expressions as well. So if you're familiar with regex patterns, you can definitely do regular expressions. Okay. And then the next thing we want to learn how to validate are objects. And there's the reason we want to learn how to validate objects is because a lot of times our data comes across from a front end in an object, right? So the data comes across in the request.body. Rec.body is an object. And so we often want to validate that object that has all the data in it, again, in the rec.body. And so what you'll see here is we actually end up having nested joy method calls. And so on the outer level, you say, hey, joy.object needs to accept this property, and this property needs to follow this format. And so let's do another example now that we validated some various strings in different ways, different numbers in different ways. Let's do an object. Okay, so back from a lunch, and now where we left off was validating objects. And so I'll make another.
Could you string?
Yeah, I'll start my stream. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's it. Nothing to do with server.
There we go.
Other than some basic configurations.
Make a new file to validate object.
Now we're on the left. Evict. So
technically, you'd be able to also add server 5.
as long as it was, of course, configured with failover cluster manager and everything like that.
Right,
And
the
it's
same
running
as server 4.
Right.
Yeah, if it was configured just as server 4, it should be able to pop up on
Correct. Now, typically, in a hybrid converged environment, you have 3 nodes. You have your building node, your partner node, and you have that.
So there's a method called joy object, and to that
In the eventuality of
we can pass properties. So let's set a name property. A name property, and then our name property will be a joy string. And maybe that's comma. Age will be a joy number. And so, I kind of left off and I said, hey, we'll be nesting these, right? So this object is going to accept name and age. And let's just save that. And so let's see, let person equals so let's just do a name and address. We'll call this object schema. obj schema. And then we'll say validate data. And we need to stop it because it's still running my last one. Node mon validate object. And this would be person. There we go. Validate person. Dot validate. And then we need a console log validation results. Okay. That's what we'd expect, right? We are saying, hey, this object has to be a name property and an age property, and we don't have a name and an age. We have a name and an address. So let's change that to age. And let's set this to 38. And now we get a valid value coming across. So we can say, hey, these are the required. Now, it's also pretty nice because if we try to do we try to add our own property, right? So our object schema only allows these two properties and nothing more, right? So we're not going to allow someone to give us some data that we're not looking for. So you can't have any less, you can't have any more. These are the exact, fields. And maybe if we change the field name to like first name, and that's not going to work. It has to be exactly name, and then that passes. And again, when it passes, it has a value attribute with the data stored inside of an object. If it fails, it has a value and an error. And then inside of error, it has details. And inside of details, really this error, person age, is not allowed. Now, again, we could format this a little nicer with, right, JSON, stringify. And the reason that I'm doing this JSON stringify is because we do want to kind of dig down into the data a little bit. There's an error. Error is an object. It has details. Details is an array. With a message, person's age is not allowed. So that's how we're going to validate objects. And again, this is very useful because the request.body is an object. And so we'll be pulling our fields out from Postman to validate some objects. Maybe we want to say email joy.string. Something like that. And our data is clean. Now, there could be a case, let's just say we were to do person name or first name and okay. You may notice if we look at the error, it says first name is not allowed, but it doesn't say anything about last name here. And so when you have multiple errors, it's kind of set by default to only show the first one. And so you may want to change that behavior. Maybe that's fine. Maybe you want to display all the errors. In this case, there's multiple errors, but this validate method by default only shows one. So the way to show all the errors is with the second argument, which is an object, and you say abort early. By default, abort early is true. We set abort early to false. And now we actually get multiple error messages back. So that's value. There's error details, first name not allowed. Did I mess up my object? That looks good. That looks good. Where did I go wrong here? Validation result, object schema, validate our data, abort early false. Let's do this. Name. Doesn't like last name, so it's barking at last name. Let's give it the... Okay. So now it says age must be a number. Then let's set this to Bob. So now age must be a number, and there we go. I just didn't like the way I had that extra property in there. It was not happy about that. But in this case, you could see name, it says age is not a number, and email is not an email. So I'm getting multiple error messages here, which is what abort early will do for us. Okay. I did mention you can do a regular expression. Let's do this. Joy.name.required. So it's pretty common. You want to make all of these required. So if I leave off email, of course, we're going to get that error. If I change that to a 3, that's accepted, but it's still, email is required. Now if I take email off of required, you can see that still passes, right? So, of course, adding the dot required does what it sounds like. It makes it required. Again, so doing these schemas in Joy is just going to help us from writing all, maybe 15 if statements. And so hopefully you could see that kind of simplifies some things. But I also kind of started to mention you can do regular expressions. And so regular expressions, if you haven't seen Regex 101, it's a very helpful website for writing regular expressions. So we can say, hey, JavaScript, and you can get popular regular expressions to help you with, let's see, this is the editor, regex library, JavaScript. You go to email, and you can see people write regular expressions all sorts of different ways. And the popular ones kind of get upvoted to the top. Email address most used, right? So maybe we, can take this. Starts with a forward slash, ends with a forward slash. Let's open an editor. Copy that. And so if you can find a regular expression that you like, just say for an email, string dot pattern. And if I paste, get rid of that I, then you call that, you give that field the name of email. And so that would be the syntax for writing a regular expression. Now, it doesn't like my semicolon right there. There we go. Email. And it passes. Okay, so again, regular expressions can be fairly cryptic in nature, and we can do a whole deep dive on how to write them. But there's useful tools out there that can help you with popular regular expressions and getting those in there. Okay, so I wanted to just kind of at a basic level demonstrate Joy, and then I wanted to bring it into some of our actual software, and so in order to do that, I'll continue on my dog walker, and feel free to code along. I have to clone this. So I'll clone my repo, sign into GitHub.
So we go back to server 2 and do the same thing. Get that command.
Okay. So here's my dog walker app. Open with code. Okay, and so what we'll be doing is validating the data coming in for our dog walker. And so, like for example, on the new, we wrote this if statement to validate, full name and hourly rate. Else invalid data, and so we'll be making some changes here. I do need to add my .env. And go to Mflix. Make sure this is where my database is. There they are. if I go to connect, drivers, copy, DB URL, DB name, port equals 5000, host equals localhost, dog walker DB,
I did. Everyone has read and execute.
and my credentials.
Let's just double check.
Yeah, no, that was you. That was, walk right past this. Back to server 2.
I mean, you can use much faster than that. I like looking at it for like
Oops.
2 seconds.
Connect, drivers, copy,
Right, so
paste,
set.
copy, paste. Grant, if you, which one of these don't need the quotes? The database name?
I have actually on this one all of them in quotes except for port and debug.
Port and debug, yeah, okay,
Yeah, mine is like yours.
cool. So, terminal, npm, run start dev.
Access is
Cannot find .env config. So I'm gonna stop. Yes, let's do an npm install.
server 2.
Make sure all of our dependencies are installed. There we go. Now let's try again. There we go. Listening to port. And let's close. Close. Dog walker app, list all dog walkers. What port are we on? 5001. Let me change my port to 5000. Port 5000.
Or not, whatever.
Now we're on 5000.
Let's go back in here. Let's go to C drive.
Might need to open an IP address on that database, so network access
It's shared.
not added.
It's shared under monster SVR1. Again, shared.
Add current IP address. Okay, .68 needs to go down here. There we go. Status pending.
Let's try that again. We did specify we need to use
Okay, active. Let's boot up my app again.
permission.
npm run start dev. Database pinged.
That makes sense.
List the dog walkers. Okay. Good. Now, for a new dog walker, so let's continue. This is just the status of where we left off with our dog walker. Okay, so we have not installed Joy yet. So that's kind of the exercise we're going through, is we're going to bring in Joy. So to do so, let's go to the terminal, npm install JOI. Okay, so we now have Joy on our package JSON, and
No, I was curious if you wanted
Yeah.
it.
I did.
We need to bring it in,
Because I can't see
as we know how to do that.
It's in
Import capital JOI from
This
Joy.
right.
Right, I just can't see them.
Oh, I see what
Right.
you're saying. Okay. I didn't realize we were limited on that.
And then we're going to say, we're going to define a schema, const
I guess we would have to
new Walker schema equals Joy object parentheses curlies and what exactly are we looking for? In a new dog walker in the body, we get a name and we get a rate. Full name, hourly rate. Full name,
if you click share
property,
under task 2.
99%.
joy.string dot minimum 1 character required. All right, that's our full name and hourly rate.
Share with.
Hourly rate, Joy number, min 1.
Read and write.
What's a max? We'll say, hey, no more than, we're not paying more than $20 an hour. Required.
Is it? Is it, sir?
Stupid stuff.
Okay.
You
Um,
can tell it should still be able to read it without meaning to write. Correct?
Step 1, define the schema, right? Step 2, get the data. Now, our data comes in from Postman or from a form, and it comes into here, right? And it comes in rec.body. So
So now I'm shutting down on server.
new Walker schema dot validate
Because it already is residing on there, right?
rec
If
dot
R3 is not the owner, right,
body.
and then shut down.
And we're gonna be refactoring this a time or two, but I just want to const validate result equals
Fuck is that on server 3?
now we don't need the if statement anymore. And we'll come back to that else. And actually, I'm going to walk through this new dog walker route hit. And maybe say if validate result dot error,
DC1.
if there's an error, res JSON
Boom. Still good to go.
res dot status 400 JSON error. Actually, we'll just send back validation result dot error. Okay, if there's an error,
Start logging.
else res.status 200, which is good. .json validation result dot. I'm trying to remember the other property. Was it? I think it was data.
Cluster manager.
So we'll just send a little, real simple, validate it, and we're going to send back error or good data. And I'm just going to hold off on my actual insert command.
Okay.
I'm either going to say one thing or the other right now. Okay, clear the screen.
Now remember I created dots.
npm run start dev. Unexpected semicolon on line 19. And joy number min is not
Now what should
joy
happen
dot
is I have
number.
server 2, server 3, and server 4. I should be able to go into any of these and verify.
Joy number
That you can access.
min
Correct.
joy dot number. What am I? Oh, don't forget your parentheses.
Okay, so that's on line server 2.
Okay, now that our syntax errors are fixed, we're expecting a full name and an hourly rate. Full name and an hourly rate.
It works.
Okay, good. We're getting back an error that says must be less than or equal to 20. So Joy is working, right? We're getting the data back, and our data validation is working. And now it's responding with good data.
So,
And so, again, benefit, it clearly defines the schema, what the data is that you're expecting. It's a nice readable format. You kind of simplified all the if-else's.
What's going on? Who's
correct.
first?
Correct. Same with this. I mean, you're just trying to get basically what is the shared resource.
So with that
No.
thing that you highlighted, you're trying to find out
If I send,
who's the shared
I'm going to
resource.
send rec.body back. In the
Yes.
case of good data, I'm just going to send the rec.body back. And so if I say 10, rec.body comes back as an object with full name and hourly rate, right? So that's essentially what we want to insert, right? So I would say something like const new walker equals rec.body.
Oh, that's good.
So we're just setting a new variable equal to rec.body. And now let's send back res.status 200 dot send our new walker back. So again, it should just come back as our new walker. And now we just call our database method, right? So instead of we need to call const db result equals a weight add walker. What's our
So as you see, all it did.
We
was
need to
say
call
files
our
are witness
method,
type of the,
which is called what? Insert
So is that
walker.
going for every cluster? That is a thing.
Insert walker, new walker.
Is it showing every cluster?
We still have an if else in here. This should be working though. So if let's list all of our dog walkers right now. Okay, no Billy Smith. Let's add a new dog walker And I would even say res.json.
So do you understand what that actually means? So we have multiple services right now, right? We have a cluster service.
Right.
We have a file share.
I do not know for sure.
It means that the cluster itself is acting as the file share with us. That is what that is telling you with the quorum. So when you're getting the cluster quorum, it's saying, okay, a cluster quorum resides on cluster 1.
New Walker
Resource
added with the
is
new
a
Walker
file share
info.
resource, and the type is a majority.
What is the
New Walker
It's the
dot.
key decision. By being the majority, it gets to make the decision on whether or not the information is
Full name.
word am I looking for?
Said it. The error is it. What would it say? Cannot convert object into a primitive value. So I needed the property of the full name.
As a witness, yes, it has the highest, like, it makes those decisions. That's a good question, yeah, because I didn't really understand what it was either.
Billy Smith. New Walker added Billy Smith. New Walker, Billy Smith. And again, if I put 100, we get error back. Now,
and then
Grant, have you been able to kind of keep up?
Yeah.
Okay. So that simplifies our logic that we wrote in here
Yes.
a little bit. I mean, we did get rid of one if block, and we added a fair amount of code here.
That's the share. Makes sense?
Because we do this on different routes, we do this kind of we call the validate method to validate a schema, and then we read data out of the rec body to put into another object. Because we do this, some of this logic is validation logic that you could extract out of that method and put into another method, right? So your methods, like create a new dog walker, ideally methods are like single purposed. And so if we look at this method, right now this method is doing a couple of things. It's doing more than one purpose. It is both validating data and inserting a walker. So a good practice would be to, again, our methods to keep them single purposed. And so for that reason, we could introduce our first piece of middleware. And so what that is a method that we're going to write. We're going to write a method that can take in validation logic from multiple routes and do this validation logic regardless of the schema that it's applying it to. Okay, and so we're going to write our first piece of middleware that's going to focus on validation that that will, again, kind of do this validation for us.
I'm gonna get up and walk around. That's like important.
So here's what we're going to do. One second here. Okay. I'm going to add, first thing I want to do is I want to add next, because that's a method that we'll be dealing with when we have middleware. Okay, we're going to write our first function And we're going to make a folder called middleware that we're going to write this function in. And in here, we're going to make a new file called valid, because what we're going to do is we're going to validate the body, right? The body that's sent from the client. And I will try and explain this as I go through. So inside of this JavaScript file, we're going to write a function and export the function. So our function is going to be called valid body. The function is going to take in one parameter, which is our schema. It's going to return a request, response, and the next method.
It's supposed to do something.
Okay, so what is this actually going to do? We're going to call our schema.validate. So we're going to store validation result. Schema.validate. So we can accept different schemas in, but we're going to call the validate. We are going to validate the rec.body object. So the different, just like we did in before, we're going to validate our rec.body. And we're not going to abort early. Abort early, false. And just like we did in the last file, if there's an error, the validation result dot error. If there's an error, we're going to say, hey, there's a problem.
It's actually kind of cool.
Return res status JSON error, and we'll just say validation result dot error. So we'll send that error back. Else we set the rec.body equal to validate result.value. Otherwise, we just keep the data in the rec body is basically what we do. And then we call next, which just goes to the next function in line in our middleware. So we can put those optional semicolons in and export this function called valid body. So a lot of this code looks pretty similar to the code we just wrote. It's just a little bit different because, well, we have to say, we have this next keyword. It's also an interesting line right here where inside this function, the first thing we do
It works. It's good.
is we return
It's not something that I would even use a whole lot, to be honest.
If I were to use it, would be
a method
the right thing.
parameter list, rec, res, and next.
Pretty cool, though.
This part is what's doing the work, though. And so valid body, we can export it and bring it in over here. So now that we have this middleware written, we can import it just like we did over here. We'll import our function, which is called
Oh, was that command seems
valid body
Yeah, I'm like, the command seems familiar.
from
I don't know why.
middleware valid
A couple
body.
of them, like this one right here, and that one I was saying. As a matter of fact, it's up there.
Okay, so now we have a function available to us called valid body that we can use on all of these routes. not just the new dog walker, but we can use it on other ones. This is the first time we're calling middleware. So the syntax for that is in between the route and the anonymous method that we wrote right here. That's where we're going to call that function. So it's going to be comma valid body. This is our function call, and we have to pass it our schema, and then we put a comma right there, and our schema is new walker schema. Okay, so now this function here, we're calling our middleware that does the validation. We no longer need this, and either this function is going to respond invalid data, or put the good data inside of the rec.body, which it's already there, new walker, insert the new walker, and respond that it worked. I deleted a set of curlies somewhere. I now have an extra set of curlies. Let me undo. Okay, I just need to delete that one right there. Okay, so let's... Now, of course, I need to try catch around this, but you can see how we just kind of cleaned up that method and put the validation logic in a piece of middleware, and now we test. And so I guess the first thing we could do is give it some bad data and see that we are still getting returned an error message. And Billy Smith 2, 10, new walker added, Billy Smith 2, and there we go. We wrote our first piece of middleware. Now, what else can we use valid body on? Well, let's see. Update route. Let's think about update route. They're all optional.
Chapter 4.
Since they're optional, we just don't mark them as required. So we can write, let's go update, and we'll update Billy Smith 2 to something else, right? So update body, full name and hourly rate. Update walker schema, joy.object. Basically the same thing, except for they're not required. So there's our update walker schema. Now we come down here, update route, comma, and we'll call our middleware that we wrote once, valid body, passing it the schema, update walker. And so this will throw an error if any of the data doesn't match this schema. And let's take a look. We get the ID from the URL, We get our updated walker from rec.body. That's our object. We update the walker. We're converting the object ID over here on this one, but we do that on the database side most of the time. And so let's kind of go back to our update route. Really, that's all we needed to do to refactor that. So let's go list all dog walkers. And let's set the hourly rate to 55. That should hourly rate to 55. That should be outside of our scope. I'm thinking because we're using middleware, we need to include next here.
Wow. That's kind of cool, huh?
Dog walker ID. Walkers, API walkers, walker ID. I wouldn't expect that one to have worked, and so let me see if it did. Okay, it did. It set his hourly rate to 55, so that did not work. Valid body. Oh, update walker schema. See that? I didn't pass it the schema. Valid body, update walker schema.
So I basically have to create.
So now, if I go back to my update walker, now I get the error. Must be less than. So if I go 20, walker updated. Billy Smith 2 is 20. Let's give him a name. Bob Smith. Walker updated. We inserted Billy Smith a couple times, but the last one updated the correct one with the ID of 31. There we go, the ID of 31. Okay, so you can see how we write this valid body middleware once. It kind of does the validation logic for us, and then we can reuse it on multiple of our routes.
Managing human capital, again, it's legal. It's nothing to do with 1 year. It's literally like ethical leadership practices and stuff like that. IT project management.
Now, deleting a dog walker.
A performance assessment, not an objective assessment. Meaning there's not more choice. I have to write a paper, it has to be. But in this case, there are 3 different sections that I have to cover, which is opposed to project proposal, which is what I just pulled up. The radio.
There's one more middleware function
Really simple proposal. Yeah, so
that
it's
we
literally
can
just-
use.
The project is.
I didn't find it particularly useful, but I'm going to demonstrate it anyways because we had valid body. Let's add one more middleware function called valid
On a work breakdown.
ID.
Either way, the work breakdown.
So this is going to validate that the
Life cycle is to
the ID that is sent over can be converted to an object ID. So as we did earlier, object ID from MongoDB, right? So we're going to make sure that we can convert whatever string they send over into a valid Mongo
So
ID.
I understand, but that was.
So here's our function, valid ID.
Not complete. Jeez. It's 25 times. For this. It's crazy.
Here's the return. Rec, res, next, arrow, curlies.
Well, some of it's some specific like project management book of knowledge stuff as well, but that is the basic concept to show you how to manage a project, that you understand the steps. In there, security testing.
So here's our new object ID.
So yeah, currently on this one, I'm going to take ethical leadership next. And then understand, we just do some objective assessments, and make a kind of a decision like this.
How long do you last?
So, this course right here, because it was so basic, I literally took the pre-assessment on April 1st, and 5 days later took the test, because I didn't need to study. Managing human capital, I completed that on the 12th, but again, it was one of those courses where I took the pre-test because I knew I was going to pass, and I kept pushing it back. So I initially took that pre-test in April, like just after I took my management orientation and the course. But I just kind of kept waiting and waiting, and I was like, I can't find it. So I took the test because the concept with building engineers is 6 months.
So here's another middleware function that basically you send in a string
And there's in 3 months, right? So if I'm done with IT project
and
by the end of June,
it modifies. So if you can convert that string
courses to my term without incurring additional fees. So once I'm done with these 3, I can add this one
into an object ID, it'll store that in the request
semester
object. It'll update the request object. So request coming from the client, request dot that string. So the ID, in other words, the object the underscore ID. So it will modify rec dot underscore ID equal to the new ID. So let me demonstrate how to use that once or twice. So again, you write this function once, and then you could just use this valid ID function. We need to export it. And then back over here, valid body,
these performance accessories right here, like ethical leadership and marketing,
import
those are
valid ID from valid ID.
advanced levels of what I'm doing here, right? Which is, project. So those are going to be all writing. Even there's a performance assessment, is a writing. So I want to get my objective points done. So done first.
And it's pretty easy to call. Writing it's a little bit more complicated. Writing that method's a little bit more complicated, but calling it's pretty simple. So like over here,
And then by the end of the
we just call
March of next year,
valid ID, then we pass in the
Wow. So you only have one master's.
technically I have 3 degrees of associate's degree, which is not much.
we'll call it Walker ID. And so now it doesn't like the fact that I missed my comma. And then now we can get our ID from rec
So
dot Walker ID.
And now this one is an MBA information technology management gap.
Because it created that right here. Rec, when you say rec sub, remember, there's 2 ways to get to the properties, using the bracket notation or the dot notation. Rec dot Walker ID.
So I have a small story for my grandpa. He has a
And then spit out the walk. So let's go get dog walker by ID and see if that works.
he hired.
So get dog walker by ID. Let's go to list all walkers. This is our first walker. Dog walker by ID. Paste it in. And let's go back. Walker ID route hit.
Like he doesn't know the whole IT aspect of it, and he had someone who was certified to come in and try to use it.
Now that should be an object ID already, so I shouldn't have to cast it again.
Because so he was wanting it in the middle of his house so he would be able to access it.
So it did get Walker by ID route hit, so it got to here, and it did spit out the ID, but I don't know that it looks like an object ID, which I think might be the reason why it's not being found. So let's go back to valid ID.
Really? You just can't move it.
Yeah, that's what they were saying. Well, that's
Param name, rec dot param name.
I'll move it. And he's paid these other people hundreds of dollars just to come out and look at it. And that comes over and moves it. He doesn't do anything. The main point of the story is that my dad's not certified in anything. And he was just able to move it and everything. So I don't know.
ID should be a Walker ID. New object ID,
So a lot of
rec
times
dot
I
params.
hate to say it, there are many, many companies out there that will be like, roll the truck, roll the truck, roll the truck. Because they roll the truck and they don't tell the customer, oh, there's a service fee involved in this. Now, that service fee doesn't go to vehicle maintenance, fleet maintenance, fuel. Because it's already
Dog
allocated.
walker not found.
It's just another way for them to make money. It is a revenue producing stream by saying, if you call us out, come out
Copy.
here and look at it, whether we do anything or not,
Paste.
there's a service fee.
Oh, wait a minute. Notice I'm sending in E0 and it's coming back something totally different. I know what I'm doing.
The point I'm saying is they came out there for money and didn't want to do the job.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that they weren't able to, they weren't legally allowed to, but there was restrictions.
I know the
They didn't
mistake.
have the skill set.
Valid ID.
And they already made their money.
Fair enough.
And that's still, I literally have experience with that, because that is what I was told to do as an ISP.
New object ID.
Wow.
They're calling us complaining. If you can't get it resolved in 5 minutes, roll the truck. They'll be charged for it. Whether it's their fault or our fault, it doesn't matter.
Notice what's happening is it is generating a new object ID instead of using this one. So E0 is what I'm sending in, but then it's posting something totally different. So my valid ID is converting it to something different. Return next, catch error. Param name was not a valid object ID. Rec dot subparam is new object ID. Rec dot params param.
No, I'm doing it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I know what it is. So this variable right here, dog walker ID, this is our variable that we need to send over to valid ID.
As a service cloud provider,
That was my mistake.
customer relationship.
So dog walker ID, these names need to match. Because that's why I was generating a new ID, because it wasn't sending the data through. So now, dog walker ID, and then this rec dot dog walker ID. So again, it creates a rec dot dog walker ID right here, equal to a new object ID using
And then you're being
rec dot params dot dog walker ID. But you can't use the dot notation when you don't know the,
Two more tasks.
because right now it's dot dog walker ID, but another method might not be dog walker ID, might be something different. And so that was my problem. This needed to match that, needed to match that. Save, run, dog walker found. And if I pass it an invalid ID, now we get dog walker ID was not a valid object ID. Otherwise, dog walker not found. That was my mistake. All right. Now we can use let's see, valid ID, valid body. We don't need to validate the ID here. This one we can validate the ID, dog walker ID, and validate the body. And then instead of getting it from rec.params.dogwalker ID, you get it from rec.dogwalker ID. And so that update route should still work. Update dog walker, Bob Smith, Bob Allen Smith. Walker updated, list all Bob Allen Smith. So now we're validating the object ID and the data being sent across from Postman.
That part is, I don't think I've done that for this either.
So that's the update route. Last one, dog walker ID. When we're doing a delete, well, we write the logic once. Now we can say valid ID, dog walker ID, and then this comes from rec dot
Exactly why I keep going.
dog walker ID, and put a comma right here. And now that we're starting getting used to writing middleware, we'll start including next in these. And the last one is a delete. We're going to delete Bob Allen Smith. So let's pass in an invalid object ID. Dog walker ID is not a valid object ID. Oops, that was the update.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
And so 3 invalid object ID, and this is on the delete route. And that deleted, that should have deleted. Oh no, that's get dog walker. Come on, where's my delete route? There we go. 3, 1, walker deleted, save it. There's Bob Allen Smith, no longer there. So that's a pretty good crash course on the Joy package. And that's where we're going to stop for today. What we're going to work on tomorrow, and the last assignment is working on the next lab, which is 0302.